Milton Friedman famously once said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So if you go back to 2007, when the Fed's balance sheet was less than $1 trillion, it over the course of the financial crisis in 2007, 2009, they ran their balance sheet up to $4 trillion. And a lot of Fed watchers said, oh, no, we're going to have inflation, we're going to have inflation. And it never happened. Well, at least not consumer prices. You could obviously, there's some asset price inflation, but the way we measure—
That is exactly what I will
yes,
argue too.
but, okay, but
we
the way we measure,
asset price inflation.
right, but the way we measure consumer inflation, there was no inflation. People kept saying, well, there's going to be inflation. Then, of course, the COVID crisis came and they ran up their balance sheet another $4 trillion, almost $5 trillion. So where they went from less than 1 to 4 up to 9, and people said, oh, we're going to have inflation, we're going to have inflation. Unfortunately, at the same time, we had the COVID crisis with all the supply chain shocks, and we had the war in Ukraine with the energy supply shocks. And so we got the inflation, and the Fed looks like maybe they escaped blame. And I guess my question is, should we blame the Fed, or do they deserve to be let off the hook because inflation wasn't inevitable and it really is more about the war in Ukraine and more about COVID supply shocks? What's your thought there?
No, they shouldn't be let off the hook, because what they did lead to inflation. And the Fed's balance sheet is also tied to the amount of national debt, which is now above 31 trillion. Because we're very lucky in the United States. We're a wealthy country, and because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, there is enormous worldwide demand for treasury debt. But along with the economic principle that Alex stated, that nothing is free, I would add the second principle, that nothing is infinite. What you had was, as Treasury borrowed to fix COVID, the Fed bought that debt. So now they hold 5.5 trillion of that debt themselves. So what is the real demand for U.S. Treasury debt? Is there an infinite demand? There are only 8 billion people in the world. At some point, there has to be, if you keep borrowing without limit, at some point you have to logically reach a point where demand is going to go down, interest rates are going to go up, the federal deficit is going to increase, and you're going to have more inflation. The problem, as you point out also with the Fed's balance sheet, is that it never comes down. It went up in 2007, 800 billion. Before this crisis, 4 trillion. Now it got up to 8.9 trillion, but it's back down to, with runoff of debt, to about 8.6 trillion. The reasons that Alex stated, they can't really dump a debt. They destroy the markets and they take huge losses. So they have to let it slowly run off. What happens if we get the next crisis and it's before 10 years? What happens if this recession is a crisis? Can the Fed's balance sheet grow infinitely? Can it buy yet more debt? At what point will people around the world stop wanting to buy U.S. Treasury debt? These are real problems, and they can't be ignored. The numbers are getting to be astronomical, and we just can't keep spending without any idea that at some point it will reach a limit and we'll have to stop.
So what's going on in the financial markets? I mean, the last consumer price inflation numbers were over 6%, but if you look at the yield on the 10-year bond, it's 3.5%. So it means investors are earning a real negative return of 3%. Now, are the financial markets wrong in their expectation that inflation is coming down? Are they willing to take a 3% loss on their investment? I mean, what are they thinking?
There is a complete disconnect right now between what the Fed says and what the bond markets in particular believe. The bond markets look at the inflation numbers and they say, well, look, the Fed can't really tell us the truth, because if they tell us that inflation is really getting better, we'll have a boom in the markets and inflation will get worse. And so they'll make their own job a bit more difficult. So they sort of have to say what they're going to say. And the question is, do you believe the markets or you believe the Fed? Knowing Jay Powell, and I think he's, by the way, an excellent Fed chairman. I think we're lucky to have him because I think he's smart and he sees the problems. I think he's very serious in stop nipping this inflation in the bud. And my own personal bet is on the Fed rather than the bond markets. But obviously, a lot of smart people have made a different decision. And if you're an investor, it's very hard to predict what is going to happen to bond yields and interest rates and market in the next year because of this basic disconnect between what the markets are saying and what the Fed is saying.
However, when you consider what central banks say and what governments say, you have to remember the fabulous saying of Jean-Claude Juncker, that great European politician from Luxembourg, who said during the 2007-9 crisis, when it gets serious, you have to lie.
Well, that seems to be a motto for lots of people. Seems to be a guiding principle, as a matter of fact.
I'm afraid so, yes.
on Capitol Hill. You know, I gotta have to wrap this up now, but there's one thing that I take from all of this, which is really with all the problems that we have, known and unknown, it is a reason, I would think, for the federal government to make sure that it was on a sustainable fiscal course, which we are not.